In every era, people think they understand their history until someone connects the dots they were never shown. Welcome to the Missing Dots, where we peel back the layers of official narratives, challenge inherited assumptions, and expose the psychological machinery that shaped the earliest chapters of Islam. Today, we step into a world where rumors acted like algorithms, tribal loyalties behave like echo chambers, and a single unverified story could ignite a civil war. If you think misinformation is a modern problem, wait until you see how it once rewrote the destiny of an entire civilization.
You know, it really is it's something to sit here right now in the quiet of this mosque courtyard. We just finished prayer, you can feel the afternoon breeze, and I'm just trying to imagine the sheer overwhelming chaos of that specific time in history.
It's really hard to reconcile, honestly. I mean, it is so peaceful right now. But when I was looking through the stack of sources we gathered for today, ranging from classical chronicles like Al-Tabari to these modern academic papers on cognitive psychology, it just shatters that peace completely.
Oh, absolutely. It's a completely different reality.
Right. And we sit around today complaining about our modern problems. We talk about how social media and algorithmic feeds are like destroying our shared sense of reality.
Yeah, the whole fake news debate.
Exactly. We think fake news is this brand new plague invented by the internet. But looking at the very first Islamic civil war, the fitna, it's shocking. I mean, it was essentially a massive, devastating information war. And I think what we need to figure out today is how that war started and, more importantly, the incredible system the early Muslims built to survive it.
Yeah, that is a very accurate way to frame it. I mean, to understand how a community that was literally led by the closest companions of the Prophet fractured so violently, we kind of have to, we have to pause the theological debates for a moment.
Right, put that to the side.
Exactly. We need to look at the physical reality of the 7th century. We're talking about the sheer physics of communication here.
The actual friction of getting a simple message from point A to point B?
Yes. Consider the geography of the early Islamic state just a couple of decades after the Prophet passed away. It had exploded into a massive empire incredibly quickly. So the center of political and spiritual authority was Medina.
Where they all lived.
Right. But the military power, the real muscle of the empire, was located in these massive garrison cities established far away on the peripheries. You had Kufa and Basra in Iraq and Fustat in Egypt.
And I mean, these weren't just quiet suburbs, right? These were restless frontier towns.
Highly restless.
Yeah.
You had thousands of soldiers, diverse tribes, suddenly living shoulder to shoulder in a rapidly changing economy. For a piece of news or an official order to travel from the caliph in Medina to a governor in Egypt, you are looking at weeks of brutal travel across the desert on horseback or camel.
Wow. So no instant verification at all?
None. Zero.
I always try to put that into a modern perspective for anyone listening. Like if you play online multiplayer games, or even if you just try to have a video call on a really bad Wi-Fi connection, the absolute frustration of latency.
Oh yeah, the lag.
Right, your ping is high, you press a button, and the game takes 3 seconds to react. Now imagine operating a massive global empire, but your latency is 3 weeks. A message takes 20 days to send and 20 days to get a reply. That delay is just a massive vulnerability.
And that latency gap is precisely what was weaponized during the crisis surrounding Caliph Uthman. The historical sources document this incredibly tense moment. So, rebels from Egypt had marched all the way to Medina. And they didn't just come out of nowhere, They had real, localized grievances.
Let's actually pause there for a second, because I think it's important to understand why they were angry. It wasn't just mindless rebellion. Like, what were the actual grievances?
It mostly came down to economics and administration. The empire had expanded so fast that wealth was pouring in from conquered lands. Uthman, trying to keep this sprawling empire from falling apart, centralized control.
Which makes sense administratively.
It does, but he appointed his own relatives, the Umayyads, to key administrative posts to maintain a tight grip. But to a veteran soldier out in Egypt or Iraq, it felt like they were the ones bleeding on the frontiers, while Medina and the caliph's family were hoarding the wealth and the land stipends.
Okay, so there's already a massive amount of dry brush just waiting for a spark.
Yeah.
They feel alienated, so they march on Medina.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
So Uthman, who is an elderly man at this point and a deeply respected companion of the Prophet, he actually sits down with them. He listens to their complaints. He makes concessions.
Oh, really? So they worked it out?
Yeah. The texts tell us they actually left satisfied. The crisis seemed completely averted. They packed up their camp and started the long march back to Egypt.
But I'm guessing the crisis wasn't averted.
No, not at all. On their way back, they notice a rider moving suspiciously, seemingly trying to avoid them. They chase him down, they search him, and they find a letter. And this letter bears the official, undisputed royal seal of Caliph Uthman.
And the contents of the letter.
It's an explicit order addressed to the governor of Egypt. It basically says that the moment these rebel leaders return home, they are to be executed.
Wait, I want to stop and think about the logistics of this for a second. If they are just a few days outside Medina and they find this letter, why couldn't they just turn their horses around, walk back into Uthman's courtyard, hold up the parchment, and ask him, hey, did you write this?
Wow.
And actually, what is even more baffling to me, historical records show that right after this letter is found, 3 separate rebel armies from completely different directions, Egypt, Kufa, and Basra, all arrive back at Medina at the exact same time. How does that happen by accident?
It doesn't happen by accident. When you analyze the network dynamics, the forensic reality of the situation becomes really clear. This was not a spontaneous emotional uprising. It was a highly coordinated psychological operation.
A psyop in the 7th century.
Literally. That royal seal on the letter. In today's cybersecurity terms, that is credential spoofing. It was a sophisticated forgery designed to bypass their natural skepticism. They saw the seal, their anger flared up, and they just stopped asking logical questions.
It was like a stolen password used to access their deepest fears.
Precisely. And the simultaneous arrival of those 3 different armies from completely different geographical regions proves it was a synchronized attack. Someone, or some hidden faction, was exploiting that massive time delay we talked about earlier.
The latency.
Exactly. They knew that by the time Uthman could deny writing the letter, the armies would already have the city surrounded. They used the latency of the communication network to outpace the truth.
That perfectly explains the mechanics of the trap, but there is a human element here that still bothers me. I mean, the letter was just a piece of parchment. Why were the people in these distant garrison cities so ready to believe it? Why did people who had never even met Uthman, people living weeks away from him, believe he was this corrupt tyrant capable of murder?
To understand the human element, we have to look at what cognitive scientists call the illusory truth effect.
The illusory truth effect.
Right. It's a psychological phenomenon where the human brain starts to accept a completely false statement as a fact simply because it hears it repeatedly. The brain is lazy. It relies on cognitive shortcuts. It equates familiarity with truth.
So even if someone tells you a rumor, and you know the person is a bit of a gossip, if you hear that same rumor from 5 different people over a week, your brain just quietly files it away as a fact.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, map that psychological vulnerability onto a 7th century tribal society. In those distant garrisons like Kufa or Basra, there was no central moderation. There was no institutional fact-checking desk.
Right.
Information moved organically through tribal gatherings, through intense kinship networks. You naturally trusted your uncle, your cousin, or the revered elders of your tribe.
It totally reminds me of how wild rumors spread in family group chats today. You get a forwarded message from an aunt or an uncle about some crazy conspiracy. You might laugh at first, but if your brother sends it and then your cousin mentions it at dinner, you start wondering if there's something to it. And that's just over a weekend.
Now imagine that dynamic in an oral society where the spoken word is everything. That same rumor about Uthman gets repeated in the morning at the marketplace, in the afternoon in the courtyard of the mosque, and at night around the fire. Narratives about his alleged corruption circulated endlessly through these kinship channels.
And they already had real economic frustrations.
Exactly. Those valid grievances were amplified by confirmation bias until they mutated.
Subhanallah. So these tribes were effectively living in ancient echo chambers. It's just like being trapped in a specific social media feed where every single post confirms your worst fears. And because everyone you respect is sharing it and everyone around you is furious about it, it simply becomes your absolute reality. You don't even question the premise anymore.
It escalates into an existential panic. They genuinely believed their religion, their families, and their livelihoods were under immediate lethal threat from a corrupt ruler. They were mobilized by a highly distorted, weaponized narrative that had achieved the status of common knowledge simply through endless, unchecked repetition. And that, tragically, is what ultimately led to the assassination of Uthman and the splintering of the early Muslim community.
So with the community literally burning down around them due to these unchecked rumors, how did the early Muslims stop this psychological infection? I mean, they didn't have the internet to issue rapid corrections. They didn't have mass printing presses to distribute the facts. How did they stop this information war from completely consuming the religion itself?
Well, they leaned on a framework that was actually already there, embedded directly in their scripture. There's a verse in the Quran, in Surah Al-Hujurat, chapter 49, verse 6.
Oh.
It explicitly commands the believers. If a troublemaker, a fasiq, brings you news, you must verify it. The Arabic word used implies a thorough, deliberate investigation. The verse explicitly warns that if you fail to verify the news, you'll harm innocent people out of ignorance and live to deeply regret your actions.
So it wasn't just like polite advice to be careful. It was a divine mandate for information hygiene.
Yes. And alongside the Quranic injunction, you had the Prophet's own severe, uncompromising warning. He stated clearly that anyone who intentionally attributes a lie to him will take their seat in hellfire.
That is a profound psychological deterrent. For a sincere believer in that era, fabricating a story or passing on a lazy rumor wasn't just a clever political trick to win an argument, it was spiritual suicide.
Exactly. It created a massive internal barrier against casual lying. But the real historical pivot, the moment the physical methodology of history changed forever, is captured by an early scholar named Ibn Sirin.
Okay, what did he say?
He made a very famous declaration looking back at the trauma of this period. He noted that before the Civil War, people didn't ask for chains of transmission. They just trusted the people speaking because they were all part of the same community. But after the fitna, after the community fractured and blood was spilled, they started saying, "Name us your men."
Name us your men. You know, sitting here thinking about it, asking who told you that, seems like such basic common sense to us today. We do it all the time. Where did you read that? Who sent you that video? Why is Ibn Sirin's statement considered such a revolutionary moment in human history?
Because they didn't just ask who and leave it at that. They took that simple concept and built a massive cross-continental auditing database around those individuals. They transformed casual human trust into a verifiable, highly structured data system.
Wow.
This is the birth of the Isnad, the chain of transmission, and Ilm al-Riyal, the science of biographical evaluation. They literally began mapping the entire intellectual network of the Islamic world.
Can you walk us through what that actually looked like on the ground? Like, how did a scholar in the 8th century audit a piece of information?
Sure. Imagine a scholar sitting in Iraq, and a traveler comes through and claims he heard a historical report from a famous teacher in Egypt. The Iraqi critics wouldn't just write it down and accept it. They would literally physically travel thousands of miles to check what academics today call spatiotemporal contiguity.
Spatiotemporal contiguity. I have to laugh. That sounds like a concept from a sci-fi time travel movie.
It really does sound incredibly dense, but it's actually a very practical concept. It's just a formal way of asking, did these two human beings actually occupy the same physical space at the same time? Did you actually breathe the same air as the man you claim taught you?
Got it.
If a student claims to narrate from a teacher in Egypt, the auditors would check the dates. If the teacher died in the year 700 and the student didn't travel to Egypt until the year 705, the chain is broken. The report is quarantined or completely rejected.
That is fascinating. So they were essentially cross-referencing ancient passports and travel logs.
Exactly, but it went far deeper than just checking dates and travel routes. They audited a narrator's memory, which they called their dat, and their moral integrity, their adala. They looked for very subtle signs of human frailty.
Like what? What kind of frailty?
Well, for instance, they looked for age-related memory decay. If a brilliant scholar was known to have lost his notebooks in a fire, or if his memory started failing when he reached his 70s, the critics would accept the reports from his early students, but they would reject or quarantine anything transmitted by students who met him later in life.
Wow. I really want you listening to picture the scale of this. Think of this like an ancient analog blockchain. Every single human being in the chain of transmission is a node. And if one signature doesn't match, if one timestamp is off, if one node is found to be compromised by bad memory or bad character, the whole block of data is rejected. It's an incredible system.
It is arguably the most sophisticated pre-modern system of epistemic hygiene ever developed by any human civilization.
But I want to challenge this idea a bit, because a modern blockchain relies on cold, hard math, and cryptography. These auditors, these critics evaluating the chains, they were just human beings. They lived through these messy civil wars. They had their own tribal loyalties, their own political biases.
Right.
So what if a scholar simply labeled a narrator unreliable? Because that narrator supported a rival political faction. Say, the critic favored the ruling Umayyads, and the narrator favored the descendants of Ali. Couldn't they just cancel out the history they didn't like by calling the other side liars?
That is a very natural skepticism, and it's actually the most common modern critique of the system. But the early scholars were acutely aware of their own human biases. To counter this, they developed what we can call the principle of ideological decoupling.
Meaning, they consciously separated a person's political views from their technical ability to transmit a story.
Yes. The master critics realized that a person's political theology is entirely separate from their technical memory and their personal honesty. An honest narrator who had strong Shia leanings or strong Umayyad leanings was still accepted as a highly reliable transmitter of history or religious practice.
So they didn't hide the bias.
No, their political bias was openly noted in the biographical dictionaries, but their data wasn't thrown out just because the critic disagreed with their politics.
Really? Even if their political views were deeply offensive to the scholar conducting the audit?
Yes, the truth was paramount. However, there was a very specific safety mechanism.
What was it?
If that highly biased narrator transmitted a solitary, highly suspicious report that exclusively served their specific political agenda, and that report contradicted the neutral, widespread accounts of everyone else, then the alarm bells would ring.
Ah, I see the distinction. So, if I'm known to support a specific political family, and I transmit a basic everyday fact about how people prayed or how a trade dispute was settled, you accept it because my memory is good. But if I suddenly produce a miraculous, never-before-heard story that completely validates my political faction and destroys the reputation of my enemies, that's when the system rejects it.
Exactly. The burden of proof was incredibly high, but it was based on empirical consistency, not political gatekeeping. They constantly checked for anomalies against the consensus of the broader network.
Okay, but this raises an obvious question for anyone looking at the Muslim world today. If this filtration engine was so incredibly precise, if this human blockchain was working as intended to preserve the truth, why do Sunnis and Shias today still have completely contradictory historical accounts of those early civil wars? How can two opposing realities survive the same rigorous filter?
Because we have to remember that the system wasn't a magic truth machine. It was a probabilistic risk management tool. It didn't generate absolute objective certainty about every single historical motive. It managed the probability of outright fabrication. First of all, different schools of thought eventually established slightly different parameters for who they considered a reliable link.
So the filter was tuned slightly differently depending on who was running the audit.
Partly, yes. But more importantly, we have to recognize how human beings process immense trauma. The early Muslims processed the heartbreak of the civil wars through different psychological frameworks as they were actually living through them. What you see in the surviving historical texts is something called observational divergence.
Observational divergence. That implies two people watching the exact same event unfold, but walking away with two entirely different narratives.
That is exactly what it is. You had honest eyewitnesses, sincere believers on both sides, experiencing the exact same tragic events. They saw the same battles, they witnessed the same negotiations, but they interpreted the underlying motives entirely differently.
So the facts are the same, but the meaning changes.
Right. One person sees an army's movement as a desperate, necessary defense of the community. Another person sees the exact same movement as a tragic, unprovoked rebellion. They both sincerely remember the event as they felt it, and they both transmit it honestly to their students. The contradiction in the texts isn't always because someone lied. Often the contradiction exists because the lived reality of the trauma was deeply fractured.
You know, reflecting on that, it actually brings a strange sense of comfort. Alhamdulillah, the fact that we still have these messy contradictions in the historical record tells us something really important about the integrity of the early scholars. The fact that reports which were deeply embarrassing to the ruling Umayyad empires and later the Abbasid empires survived in the texts proves that the history wasn't just scrubbed clean by the victors.
It wasn't completely sterilized to serve the state. The state did not have a monopoly on the historical memory.
Right. The system was remarkably fault-tolerant. It didn't just delete everything that made the ruling class uncomfortable. It preserved the friction. It preserved the raw, divergent memories of a community that went through something unimaginable, trusting that later generations could weigh the evidence.
And that preservation allowed something beautiful to happen. Because they preserved these chains of transmission so meticulously, modern researchers centuries later can actually audit their work. Using modern network analytics, historians have mapped out these ancient chains using computational models to trace the flow of information across different sectarian lines.
That is incredible. And what do they find when they run that data through a modern computer model?
They find that beneath the layer of sectarian differences, beneath the differing interpretations of who is ultimately right and who is wrong, the core structural facts miraculously hold up. The dates of the battles, the major events, the key figures who were present, they align across mutually hostile networks. That structural convergence proves that the underlying core narrative is historically real. It wasn't just invented out of thin air decades later.
That is profound. Rumor built history. It shaped the trauma of an entire generation, but it didn't get the last word. The early Muslims recognized they were vulnerable to bias. They saw how easily their own minds and their own communities could be hacked by false information and forged letters. So they didn't just throw their hands up in despair. They built the greatest verification system of the ancient world to fight back.
They really did.
And that leaves me with a final thought for you to consider as we wrap up today. When the early Muslims built the Isnad, the chain of transmission, they thought they were just protecting the history of the Prophet. But in doing so, they accidentally created something even bigger. They built a massive, decentralized, peer-to-peer education system that transcended the borders of empires. Even when the caliphs became corrupt, or when the political empires eventually crumbled, these scholars had built a parallel network of authority based purely on truth-telling and intellectual rigor, not on swords. That invisible network of trusted men and women became the true backbone that held the civilization together for centuries. So the question for you, living in today's era of overwhelming digital noise where algorithms constantly push us toward anger and polarization, is this. They built the Isnad to protect their reality. What are we building right now to protect our own minds? To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May a log grind to success. Don't forget to, come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.